Hello everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Anna, and as Alice said, I'm Head of Support Services at Ovacome, and please do get in touch with us. Any questions, anything that you want to talk through, then please do give us a call or email us. All the details are on our website. You can also message us through the website, and you'll be talking with either me or my colleagues Julia and Laura. We'd love to hear from you. We are here to support you, and we're happy to talk absolutely anything through. And I'll just also mention that Anya gave a talk which some of you might have been at earlier, and is now available on our website. It was I think a couple of weeks ago now, wasn't it? But it was about exploring fertility options. So for any of you who missed that or would like to see it again, that is up on our website now, along with other Staying Connected webinars and talks that we've had. So do have a look on those pages and see what useful information there is on there. But I will now hand over to Anya from Fertility Network UK to talk about adoption. Thanks, Anya.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me back. It's really lovely to be here. My name is Anya, and I'm the regional organiser for a UK charity called Fertility Network UK. We support people at all stages of family building, right from education projects in universities about fertility issues and your fertility, right through to going into treatment and then coming through the other side after treatment doesn't work. So looking at support for people if they're looking at different options, looking at donation, looking at adoption, and even looking at life without children and how to make the most of it. So we are an umbrella organisation, and we support people at all stages. Today I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite topics, which is moving from treatment to adoption. And it's such an important topic for me because I've worked within this sector for about 14 years, but I'm also the mother of 2 children from IVF and 1 from adoption. And so I'm really passionate about adoption, but I'm also really realistic about adoption and about the additional knowledge, information and support that perhaps might be needed with the process of adoption. So I'm going to speak briefly about the adoption process today, and specifically about adoption post-treatment, and then open up to any questions that people may have. And again, with the knowledge that this is an ongoing relationship with Fertility Network, so you may suddenly think of something in the weeks to come, and please do get in touch with us, please do get in touch with me, and I hope this is the start of thinking through some of these issues, maybe for some of you. So we're going to look today about the reality of adoption and some of the statistics about that. And the last stats gathered about adoption are that 40,000 children and young people enter the care system per year in the UK, which is a staggering 109 children every single day will enter the care system. There's currently around 99,000 children in the UK who are classified as looked after away from home, and that's an increase of 3% from the previous year. More than 65,000 children live with almost 55,000 foster families. And at the 31st of December 2018, there were 2,750 children waiting for adoption. The average age of a child up for adoption within the UK is around 1 to 4, and it tends to settle on around 3 to 4 years old is the average age of most people adopting. So about 8% of children were adopted by couples and 12% by single adopters. 14% of children were adopted by same-sex couple, either in a civil partnership, married, or neither. So the majority of children are adopted by couples, but then there's many single adopters, and 14% are adopted by same-sex couples. So these are, there's no one-size-fits-all for adoptive families. So if you are thinking about adoption, I would encourage you to look into it. A little bit about our story. As I mentioned, I'm a mother of 2 children from IVF. That was after a 6-year battle with infertility and 5 rounds of IVF. We then, when my youngest was about 4 years old, we chose to look into adoption as well, because it was something that we'd always thought about. And having been through treatment ourselves, we'd been on quite a long emotional journey about what family actually was. And one of the things that came back to us again and again was actually family was more than biology. I'm from a family where there's adoption within the family anyway. Due to my husband's issues and my issues in terms of the realities of IVF, we'd had to look at genetics, and we'd had to look at donation of one form or another. And actually we'd sort of come to the conclusion that family was about lived experience rather than biology. So for us, adoption felt quite a natural progression, something we really wanted to explore. But even so, I think we went into it fairly naively. I think we felt that because we'd been parents before, that actually we knew what we were doing with adoption. And although there are masses of similarities, there are differences as well. So we took a long time to adopt, much longer than most people would do these days. It took us about 3 years from start to finish to adopt. But we found the experience actually okay. Certainly after going through fertility treatment and all the uncertainties around that, we found the process of adoption, it was okay. I know other people find it more invasive and struggle with it slightly, but for us, we found the process of home visits preferable to self-injections and uncertainty any day. And actually we had a good rapport with our social worker, and so it wasn't that big a deal. It felt okay. I know this does vary, but that was just our experience. So we had a training weekend with other couples, and then we had about 8 months to a year of home visits and questions, and looking at our childhood, looking at our parenting, looking at our expectations. And we found that really helpful, actually, at just starting to gauge the reality of adoption. So we went through that process for a long time, and then we went to what they call approval, which is when they say, yes, we do approve you as adoptive parents. And that's a really special day where you go before a panel of people who are generally quite nice, and they look at your files and say, yes, you're okay to be adoptive parents. We went for a celebration cup of coffee after we were approved, and as we were sat there on our phones, a profile picture came up of a little boy who looked amazing, and we were quite keen that we would adopt a little boy, not for any particular reason other than we already had, our youngest was a boy, and we thought that would mix well. And the profile picture came through. He was at the time 12 months, so quite young. Some quite big, not warnings, but things that they'd wanted to highlight in terms of potential medical issues. But he looked amazing, and we wanted to find out more. We then began the process of liaising with his social worker and speaking through our social worker. But that process didn't take that long, and fast forward sometime there, we ended up meeting with his social workers and being approved to be his specific adoptive parent. We then began the process of meeting with him, and I'll talk about that if anyone's interested as well. It's very surreal meeting someone that's being called your child for the first time, but amazing as well. And that process went on for about 2 weeks. And then at the end of that, after we were approved to be his parents, he came to live with us. And a year later, the court order was granted and he became our son. And that in some ways is the beginning of the story with adoption. So with adoption, it's sort of the reverse of fertility treatment, in that actually we found the process okay, but then post-adoption there were quite a lot of issues and medical things that we had to face and support structures that we urgently needed to get in place that actually were more difficult. So we found the first 6 months post-adoption really okay, and then some of the medical complexities of that our son has came out more apparently, and we had to get some quite urgent medical and emotional support for us as a family. Again, more than happy to talk about any of that very openly. But where we're at now is he's been with us for about 7 years. And I would say it's one of the best things that we've ever done, but certainly one of the hardest things we've ever done. And for anyone looking into adoption these days, I would say really get as much information as you possibly can, and make sure your support structures are really robust and really in place pre-placement. So that's a little bit about our experience. I think when you're looking at adoption, big major life events, as many of you watching today will have experienced, I think it's really worth being aware that you will have a level of trauma and grieving anyway because of the experiences you've been through. Anyone who's been through fertility treatment, for example, will have been dealing with a level of anxiety and a level of trauma and grief. And if there are numerous failed cycles, for example, there is a feeling of bereavement almost that you will be carrying. And it's for this reason that there is always advised to be a break between treatment and adoption. So most adoption agencies will recommend 6 months to a year. And during that time, it can feel very frustrating if you're someone that's been through treatment. You just want to get on with it. And I totally can understand that there's a feeling of just wanting to move on with life. But actually that 6 months to a year is really important in terms of building yourself up, in terms of doing the research, in terms of getting self-care in place. And these things aren't optional extras. It's really easy to talk about these things as though they're periphery and they don't matter as much as the real stuff, which is either fertility treatment or adopting a child. Actually, self-care is probably the most important thing that you can get in place during that time. And so I'd really encourage you to look at how best you can do that, who you can be reaching out to find more information about adoption, what you can read, what's in place, so that you can then at the end of that time contact either a local authority or an adoption agency such as Barnardo's or Quorum and say, yeah, we've come through, we've sort of moved on a little bit. Now I would add to that that there is in some ways no such thing as totally ever just moving on from failed treatment or from some of the other big life events that I'm sure you'll have experienced. So there's a naivety of thinking, right, you get 6 months and everything's fine, you can now adopt. But I think it's a useful stopgap and a useful breathing space. But please don't feel that if at the end of 6 months to a year, there's still sadness about fertility treatment failing or having gone through the experience that you've gone through, that you are unable to adopt. Big experiences in life we often carry with us in general. So there's never going to be a time when you are perfectly healed and able to be an adoptive parent. That's a myth. But what the break does is provide valuable self-care time, and I would definitely say that this is crucial. And one of the reasons I'd say this is so crucial is actually, I mentioned earlier the age that most adopted children are within the UK, but actually the majority of children, also the vast majority of children within the care system, will be dealing with a level of trauma and anxiety themselves. They're in the care system for a reason. People aren't taken away from their birth family, their biological family, unless there's really quite a big reason, whether that's domestic violence or exposure to drugs and alcohol or other reasons. The children are there for a reason, and the children, whether they've been separated even from birth or from 4 years into being in foster care placement, there will be a level of trauma that these children are carrying. So if the children are carrying trauma and you are a traumatized person post-treatment, then this is a difficult mix and can lead to further complications. So again, that's another reason why just finding that stopgap, finding the self-care is so important for the sake of you, but also for the sake of the children that are up for adoption. So one of the other key things that's talked about when adopting post-treatment is that adoption almost is seen as a bit of a cure for infertility. And you'll know this if you've ever heard the phrase being thrown at the infertile community: oh, you can just adopt, don't worry, there's always adoption and there's always your plan B with adoption. And adoption is not there to fix infertility, which is something that makes me so cross about why we're only talking about adoption to the infertile community. You know, this is a community that's been through such a lot already. Why are we then just assuming adoption is the next best thing and the adoption will cure the issues for them? Actually, you can still be grieving about infertility and be an amazing parent through adoption, and those two things can run hand in hand. But an adopted child won't be the sticking plaster for the hurts through infertility. It's an amazing route to parenthood, and it's one I will always advocate for, but it's not a magic bullet. So I would encourage you during that 6 months to look at ways to create some form of closure if you are coming to the end of treatment and moving on to adoption. Things that people have done in the past are perhaps writing a letter either to yourself or to your child that you wish that you'd carried. People have planted a rose bush to mark the end of one thing and another. They've done something tangible that shows the end of one period and the start of another. And so it can be useful to think of some kind of acts of closure. There's no perfect time to stop treatment either. That needs to be said right at the start as well. People often ask us as a charity, how do you know when it's the right time to end treatment and look at adoption? There isn't a perfect solution. It's a mixture of emotional toll, what you can deal with practically, and often financially as well. And people will come to conclusions in different ways and at different times. One person will do one round of IVF and say never again. Another person will do 10 and say never again. There isn't a right time to stop. It's only what's right for you as an individual and or as a couple. So I would say that knowing when is best to stop treatment comes down to what we describe as the 51% analogy, which is that it is the better of the options. It's 51% better and in favour of stopping treatment and looking at adoption. There is no perfect, but it is just whatever will be better, not the best for you as a couple. So you're then moving on to this time of the imposed stopgap before looking at approaching an agency or your local authority. Local authorities and agencies often do open days, and I'd encourage you to attend maybe a local authority one and an agency one and see how you feel. I can't ever advise as to who the best agencies are and who the best local authorities are, but all I would say is really look at what support they have in place post-adoption, because that's the key thing for me. How will they support you going forward as a family? So have a look at the open evenings. One, again, throwaway thing that I'd say just to be really wary of with open evenings is they either tend to be best case scenario, so lovely shiny families that you sometimes will see during Adoption Awareness Week, or they'll throw absolute worst case scenarios at you, and it's almost a feeling of who's left standing in the audience that can then go forward to go onto the adoption training sessions. I remember leaving our first ever adoption evening and just thinking, good grief, why would anyone ever adopt? This just sounds so awful. But what I think those evenings are doing are almost trying to put worst case scenarios out there so that you check how robust you're feeling, check the reality of what you can and can't cope with. And I'd say actually the reality of adoption obviously is somewhere in between those, but hopefully more towards the really good side. Adopting a child with a level of trauma is very demanding, but it is an amazing route to parenting, and that's all I'll ever say about adoption. So I would, post going to an event like that, go and speak to people who've adopted and who will talk to you about the reality of it. I know that there are some brilliant pre-adoption meetings that you can attend either through Adoption UK or through organisations such as We Are Family, who will introduce potential adopters with actual adopters. And these are so useful in just bringing out the reality of the situations. So I would encourage you to do that, to read. Don't get too overwhelmed with the message boards, because as you know, with any message boards, people tend to post either with a real high or a real low, and generally they're the real lows. So don't put all of your concept of adoption onto the message boards, but they can be a useful way of starting to meet with other people and get the bigger picture. And then just starting to familiarise yourself with the type of child that is up for adoption, what some of the issues may be, and what some of the issues you as an individual and potentially as a couple can deal with. And this is something that comes up during the adoption process. They will give you a list. Again, it feels like worst case scenarios, but it's a massive list of potential issues that an adopted child may be dealing with. Not all of them on the list, but a range of things from fetal alcohol to having witnessed domestic violence, to, you know, a huge range of things. And for you to look down the list and just think, actually, really with my head on, not my heart, what can we deal with as a couple? So we had to say, for example, with our specific scenario, having 2 children at home already, we really couldn't deal with a child. We didn't feel equipped to deal with a child that had dealt with huge amounts of sexual abuse or had been in a home where there was sexual abuse. That wasn't something that we'd be able to cope with. And it felt awful to already be pushing potential children, potential matches away, but we knew we had to be honest for the sake of the child and for the sake of us as a family. So we came up with a strategy of who we could and couldn't deal with, and any good social worker will be unpicking that for you and looking at you as a family and looking at the type of child that you would be best equipped to take on. And that social worker and individual adoptees, adopters relationship is key there. So being really honest and then picking up on your strengths and weaknesses is really foundational. So I would use that time around then to be building knowledge, building awareness, and then if feeling able to approach those agencies and to be going through the initial inquiry stage, home visits, which at the moment are amazingly generally being done even remotely, tours of the house via Zoom. And then at some point it will almost inevitably mean some kind of home visit. You'll need to go through medical checks as well to check that you are as healthy as can be, again, for the sake of the children and for yourselves. It's generally quite a routine doctor's appointment to look through your medical files, but also to look at how you're doing now. So that's something to be aware of. And then beginning the process of adoption. And the process these days should be between 8 months to a year, all in all. So it's not too long a process. And most people find it generally okay. Again, using that time proactively to get as much information as possible and to be building your support structure. And again, this is something that I just can't overstate, that you really need to make sure you've got people around you that if you're having a really difficult day with a child, having trouble settling into your new family, if you're stressed, who will you call? Who's your support team? And getting that in place before even being matched with a child is crucial. Again, that will come up with the meetings with the social worker, but it's really important that you don't just lip service to that, but you make sure that's in place. So one of the best things that we did, sadly it was post-placement for us, but one of the things that I would most advise doing is any adoption agency that you're involved with, seeing if they will provide a family and friends day. We had huge issues with adoption with our family, some of our family and friends, not understanding why our child was acting as they did, why we were parenting as we did. And if we'd been able to do a family and friends day pre-placement, I think we'd have saved a lot of heartache. These are amazing days, a few hours with a professional, meeting with a few key family and friends that will be on your support structure to explain the reality of adoption, to explain the reality of adopted children within the UK, and the realities of the parenting that will be needed for an adopted child. So therapeutic parenting is a phrase that we often talk about, but it's basically not just parenting, it's parenting plus. It's dealing with a child with a level of trauma and therefore needing to parent in a very different way. So a family and friends day can be hugely helpful, and if you can do that pre-placement, I would really encourage you to do so. So adoption, as I said, is an amazing thing to do. It's about self-care for you and self-care for the children, reality of adoption, not fixing everything in your life, but being an incredible route to parenting. So it's an amazing subject and one I could talk about forever. I feel like I've touched the surface of this, but I'd really love to hear actually what your questions are today and how I can best support going forward. So back over to you, Anna.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Anya. Thank you for all that information and such honesty. Thank you. So the questions that we've had come through, the first one you've answered, I think, what is the length of process to adopt? So you mentioned
but it averages around 8 months to a year. And there's a real structure. If you go on, there's a great website called First for Adoption, and they literally break down the process, and it's very manageable. And I think in some ways the use of Zoom and different platforms for meeting remotely in some ways has sped up the process, because often there was problems with when could you meet with the social worker. You're generally busy working people. How can you fit in social work meetings into that? But actually Zoom has opened up that. So we're finding that the process is slightly enabled recently through that, but it should come in under a year.
Okay. And what is the cost? It's
free. So again, after fertility treatment, for us, that was just very nice that we weren't constantly there with the credit card. Adoption within the UK is free. You approach an agency for the very simple reason that actually you're doing the state a huge favour, and to keep a child within foster care is costly. So from a purely economic value, adoption helps society. So there is even post-adoption a little bit of financial support for children who are adopted, something called the Adoption Support Fund, which we're really hoping isn't removed over the next few years, but was set up a few years ago by the government to provide access to service for families post-adoption. So there should be a measure of financial support so that you can access support as a family. There's also support through things like the disability living allowance, which we claim for, and helps us hugely as a family just in providing that little bit of extra support. But no, within the UK, adoption is free. I don't know loads about overseas adoption, but my understanding is that sometimes there's a cost implication for that. But there's so many children within the UK up for adoption anyway, that I would encourage you, if possible, to look within the UK.
Someone said, how possible is it to adopt a newborn? Which again, you did cover.
Yeah, I did cover, but there are schemes whereby you can, they have different titles, but the concept is fostering to adopt. So within this scheme, you're seen initially as a foster family and a foster parent. And the idea being that you will be looking after a child probably from a few days old as a foster parent, but with the idea that if that baby is unable to go back to the birth parent, that you potentially could be the adoptive parent. That's probably the main way that you'd look at having a baby within the UK for adoption. So I know, for example, Quorum as an agency did a lot of work on this. It used to be called concurrent fostering. And there's amazing pros and cons to it. The con is that obviously you have to hold the adoption fairly lightly at the beginning, because there is the reality that this baby may go back to birth family. The reality of that is that that doesn't happen very often. I don't know what the stats are now, but it used to be that around 95% of children wouldn't go back to birth family anyway. So that's the con, is that you're holding this lightly. The pro is obviously you're bonding from a much earlier age than you would do if you were adopting a 4-year-old who's already been through foster families and a level of trauma. So there's pros and cons with fostering from a baby. One of the things that is often overlooked when fostering an older child is that you're more aware of the needs because they've started to come out. You're more aware of any medical implications and any of the effects of trauma. With a 4-year-old, you can see what's happened. So, for example, going back to our story, our little one, we took on, well, we were sort of matched with him at 12 months, but at 15 months he came to live with us, and it looked fairly plain sailing for the first few months, and it was only after a bit that actually some of his medical needs became very apparent. So that wouldn't have happened so much if we'd been adopting him at 4, but the plus point is that we've been bonding with him since he was 15 months old as well. So there's pluses and minuses. I totally get the desire to have a baby. I really do. And I think post-treatment, that's one of the things that often comes out. But please just be aware that there are pros and cons with adopting a baby. But those scenarios are out there. I think Quorum still do that. And I think there's another few agencies that do that. So it's definitely worth looking at.
Thanks, Anya. Next question is about financial support, which you've covered. Does cancer history disqualify from adopting? If not, what extra checks are required? Yes,
so we did some work on this as a charity a few years ago, and it doesn't disqualify you. It's not an outright no, but any agency will need to know that you are well. Basically, that's the bottom line, is they want to, adoption at the heart of it is about the child more than the adult. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but from an adoption agency's point of view, they're looking for a family that's going to be able to long-term support this child. So what they want to know is that someone's healthy. So they will want to look into your records around any cancer treatment that you've got. They will want to know that you are able to deal with that. And then any good agency will know that with any person, there's a level of uncertainty and a level of medical uncertainty with all of us. You know, I could get anything tomorrow in the same way that anyone can, but they want to know as far as able that you are healthy. So that will be a doctor's visit, and there may be some additional scrutiny around that, but it's just making sure that you are well, and that's it. But please don't be put off. Some agencies may be slightly more cautious than others, but any good agency will see that you are well and healthy and have a desire to take on a child, and that's the bottom line.
So there's a couple more questions sort of along the same lines, but do you know anyone who's adopted with long-term stable disease? And also someone saying, as someone who was diagnosed with ovarian cancer nearly 2 years ago now, when would be the best time for me to be able to begin any type of process of adoption? Do you only get considered if you're 5 years, no evidence of disease?
So I would approach agencies. I would look at a couple of key agencies, so probably your local authority, and then choose one of the private adoption agencies, so Barnardo's, Quorum, Pact, and ring them and ask to speak to someone personally and say, what's your policy on this? Because it will vary from place to place. Yes, I do know people that have adopted post. I don't know how many years they were okay for, but again, I have a feeling that that's going to vary. There isn't a specific rule. You just need to approach and say, look, I can provide medical evidence. This is how you know I'm fit and healthy now. What's your internal decision on that? And just find out, and always approach a couple of places. People can find themselves being really put off by an unhelpful phone call with one person in one adoption agency, and my advice for that is just to ask around, 2 or 3 places. You can speak to someone at the end of the phone who's had a really bad day and is doing their best to put everyone off adoption that day. I've heard ridiculous stories about people ringing up who were ex-smokers or who had a dog, or just crazy stuff that you think, what's that matter? And they've got through to the wrong person at the end of the phone, who's just doing their best to almost put people off that day. So I would just say, go and ask a few people, get some advice, and see what the expert advice is.
Great, thank you. What's the adoption process like for EU nationals living in the UK?
Gosh, that's a very big one at the moment. I don't know, actually. That's a really interesting question, and I'm not even going to fudge the answer. I know what I hope the answer would be, and that it's a level playing field. That's what I absolutely would hope it would be, but I can't say that for definite. So I think, again, it's worth just ringing up any good adoption agencies and saying, this is the scenario, what's your advice on it? And then please let us know. It's not something that we've looked into, actually, but I would hope that it's a level playing field.
Right. What information is available about the health of babies and children in advance, and statistically, what is the average healthiness?
So the main issue, medical issue with children would be exposure to alcohol or to drugs, is sort of the biggest one. But there's also many other issues that come up. Some sound like they're from more of a psychological point of view, but then can have physiological impact as well. I think in terms of the information that you're given, you will get a doctor's report. You will get you should have several doctor's reports on any child that you're potentially looking to be linked with. You will have a meeting with a doctor. Now, the thing with that is sometimes the meeting with the doctor happens at the same time as the approval panel. So remember, I said there are 2 panels that you go to. One is approval to adopt, one is approval to be matched with a specific child. You can meet with a doctor at either of those 2 stages, and that can be tricky because by that point, for many people, there's an emotional investment with that child. So where possible, I would ask for as much medical information as possible about that specific child. I would also go away and do some research on some of the, the realities of children up for adoption, but they come from complex backgrounds, really quite difficult backgrounds that I realised that I was very naive about certain aspects of society and how tough it can be. And reading just our child's profile and his family background, which was very comprehensive, you get a lot of information, was a massive eye-opener. But you should get doctors' reports on specific children, and you should also be given advice about the realities of what that means. So, for example, one of the big issues with children up for adoption and the medical issue that our child faces, it's called fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And this is a very common issue with children up for adoption, and it's a lifetime problem that the children will face and that our son will have to face and deal with. And exposure to alcohol within the womb and the impacts that that's had are lifelong and will require lifelong intervention. And I wish we'd had more practical help with the realities of that pre-adopting. It would not have put us off. We've got the right child and we adore him. He's bonkers and exhausting and we adore him. But I wish someone had really practically sat us down and went, okay, he is almost certainly going to have fetal alcohol. This is what it will mean. It will mean living with a child with what looks like ADHD. It will mean cognitive impairment. It will mean impulse control issues. So he has masses of problems with impulse control. But I am cracking that by using fruit pastels at the moment. And we're learning a lot about what self-control means on the way to school by him not chewing a fruit pastel. This isn't the most robust medical answer for you, but it seems to be working for us. But this is, 6-7 years on that we're suddenly going, oh, that helps, and that's what that means, and this is him. This isn't him trying to be naughty. This is how he functions, and we wouldn't have him. We wouldn't have any other child. But I wish we'd known more about the realities of fetal alcohol before we adopted. And I think there's a lack of continuity in the adoption process. So much at the moment is about pre-placement, and there's not enough emphasis on when the child comes home, how you will cope. There really isn't. And that's something I feel very passionately about. So I would do as much research on the medical issues, the psychological issues that face adoptive children. It's almost unheard of to adopt orphan Annie. So just a blank canvas, normal child that you will adopt and there's no real issues. It's almost impossible. If a child is being taken away from their birth family, the reality is that there will be some level of trauma. End of. So it's about being as informed as possible and getting the support in place.
That actually leads on to our next question, Anya, which is what psychological support is available for families via adoption for adults and children?
Not enough is the quick answer, but there is support. So again, that's where it comes down to your adoption agency really providing some good, robust post-adoption support. So there are therapeutic support interventions that all local authorities should offer you. I should say when a child is adopted with you, the support structure at the beginning should be provided by that child's local authority. And then it crosses over to your local authority after a set amount of time. But both local authorities should be able to access therapeutic involvement, whether that is the realities of therapeutic parenting, so going on courses about how to parent a child with trauma, which can be so invaluable. We've done the same course twice because it was so good, and we have had to unlearn what we thought parenting was, because it doesn't work with child number 3. It doesn't work with our son. So there should be support for parents. There's therapeutic support for the children themselves. There's, you know, age appropriate, obviously. There's support available for wider families, but support isn't as available as it should be. And we find that, so for example, Adoption UK did a survey recently, and they're redoing it for this year's adoption week coming up. But basically, most adoptive parents would still say adoption is a positive thing. But what they also say is that support isn't available in the way it should be. And I would totally agree with that. You end up scrabbling for support. So a good agency, good thinking ahead from you as a prospective adopter, even at this stage, are 2 key things. And then just seeing what's available. The other routes that adoptive parents often end up going down is during the school years, when, again, trauma can be reignited with adopted children trying incredibly hard to fit into a one-size-fits-all school environment, and then just finding themselves falling apart, which is absolutely what our little boy did. He just couldn't do the right thing according to the school. So we moved schools, but we also then began a process of getting him statemented, so that there is an awareness of the complexities of his needs from a school perspective. And that's another stream of support that often is used by adoptive parents and is so useful. We are now at the most amazing school where he's doing really well. He has a one-to-one worker. He's on a statement of needs, and that will go right through into secondary school. And he's getting the support that he needs, and we're getting the support that we need. But we did have to fall apart before that stage, and I don't want that for anyone watching today. I want, you know, the self-care and the structures to be in place for you.
Thanks, Anya. And then the last question that we've had come in, so if anybody wants to add a question, do put it in the chat or the Q&A, because we've got 10 minutes. So, but the last question is, what's the youngest age a baby can be adopted, which you did touch on previously. Is that sort of across all
Yes.
different services and things?
Yeah, so with the fostering to adopt scheme, often people are being, you know, the child is coming from hospital to the family. So it's, you know, a day, 2 days old. So you are being primed all the time that you may well be about to receive a baby. So you can adopt a baby from 1 or 2 days, well, can foster with the intent to adopt. Other than that, like I said, the average age is around 4, but some people do end up just normal route adopting under 1 year old. There are children under 1 year old within the care system, but actually they're just very, very unusual. So you are more likely to look at being placed with a normal adoption route with a 3-4 year old. But again, there are real pros and cons to that. By 3 or 4, you will know some of the complexities that are there for that child and be better able to help with it. So I would say don't be put off by that. The other thing just to throw out as well is there are huge numbers of siblings waiting to be adopted. And adoption agencies are desperate to keep siblings together. So that's something for people to be thinking through as well, whether if adoption's on the cards for you, could you adopt a sibling group? You know, 2 children at once. And again, there's real pros and cons to that process, but the pro is that you're keeping 2 little children together that would be, again, re-traumatized by being pulled apart. So do look into adoption as for siblings. That's definitely something worth looking into. But yeah, you're looking in general around the 3 to 4 years age.
Great, thanks, Anya. And I was just wondering, you mentioned about forums and things, and the pros and cons of forums. And I was just wondering if somebody wanted to know about sort of adoption stories and from the point of view of parents and people who've adopted, are there any sort of books or other resources that you think, obviously every family is different and every child is different, but are there any books, things that you think were particularly helpful or you know, get the balance right in terms of challenges but also rewards?
I think Adoption UK are an amazing organisation, and they've got profiles of the type of children that would be up, and also they run these webinars now where you can speak to real adopters and hear their stories. So I think Adoption UK is really useful. First for Adoption. I really like the books that Sally Donovan has written. So she's an adoptive parent and she's very funny. Follow her on Twitter. She's great, and she's written some great books on adoption that are warts and all. They'll talk about when life is tough, it gets really tough, but when, you know, life is brilliant, it's like nothing else. But she doesn't sugarcoat it, nor does she say this is, you know, awful. So I like her realism. But I think they're really good. There's some good communities on Twitter. I think if you can take away some of the toxic nature of Twitter, there can be some really great communities. Instagram, there's, oh, I've forgotten her name now. What's her name? There's some really good Instagram adoptive parents as well that are quite real. There is one in specific. I will send the link to you after this. I'm sorry, but yeah, there's some great communities out there, and ultimately, you know, adoption is a great route to parenting, and it is an amazing thing to offer a child a home that would not have a home otherwise. I think that's the bottom line. It requires additional support. If you've been through any form of trauma, like I said, either fertility treatment in and of itself or what many people from your organisation will have faced, you will need extra support, and you will need to maybe just an extra level of self-awareness and self-care that just will be needed. However, I remain an optimist about adoption. I think it's a really, really good thing to do, and I can't imagine my life without my little boy trying to not chew a fruit pastel for 10 minutes, nor do I want to. So that's my bottom line, is that the fruit pastel moments in life make the other stuff worth it.
Great, thank you, Anya. And question that's just come in: what is the process if the adopted child in future wants to connect with the birth family?
Yeah, really good. So as of 18, they can try and ask, well, they can ask for details of their birth family, and can arrange to meet. It's up to them. They're legally entitled to. Up till the age of 18, it's encouraged that there's some form of communication between birth family and adoptive family, and the majority of adoptive families do this through letterbox contact. So once a year receiving a letter updating. This has various levels of success. So I know of adoptive families that are in touch with the birth family even now with quite young children, and it works really, really well. One of my good adoptive parent friends has met with the biological mum, and they had a very emotional but very good meeting, and they stay in touch, and that is one option. But ultimately this is about what's best for the child. So for our specific scenario, letterbox contact was what was advised, but sadly it's never actually worked. We don't hear. So we've started through life story work to help our little one to understand a little bit about his background. Obviously we've spoken about adoption. It's just, he knows that he's from a different family. He knows that there's half siblings out there, and he knows that if it comes to a point when he's older, he wants to follow up with that and reconnect, then that's up to him. And there's difficulties with that and there's emotions with that, but the reality is this is about what's best for my son. And if the best thing for him is to at least try to reconnect, then we support him with that. And he asked me the other day if I'd go with him, and I would. So that's the bottom line. But it's a hard concept, I think, for some prospective adopters to get their head round, understandably. But the heart of it is always what's best for that individual child.
Great. Okay, thank you, Anya. Well, we've come pretty much to the end of our time, and I'm just checking there's no further questions. But was there anything that you wanted to sort of say to finish, Anya?
Please stay in touch. Please do feel free. If anyone wants to even ring and have a chat, do that. 2 things coming up that will be of use is Fertility Awareness Week that we as a charity run, and that's the beginning of November. And Adoption Week is around the same time. And there'll be loads of resources, there'll be loads of media stories, lots of webinars for you to connect with. So you're looking into this at a good time. That will be coming up. But yeah, ultimately, it's an incredible adventure to go through, a hard one at times, but one I would recommend everyone in society look at, not just people who've been through fertility treatment, but everyone to look at as a way to become a family.